Hello again. Today we're going to be graphing our sine and cosine functions with horizontal shifts. This is our C value here will be our horizontal shifting. Notice it's the angle plus or minus some value here. So that's our C value, and that's what affects our shifting of the graph left or right on the x-axis. To do this, there's a lot more calculations up front that we have to do to find our critical points. It's not as easy as starting with 0, going to the end of the period and breaking it up into 4 even increments. There's a little more work here. Okay, so the first thing you need to do is we need to identify what our period is. Our period is 2 pi divided by b, same old formula we've been using, so that's 2 pi divided by 1 or 2 pi. The next thing we need to find is our starting point. Because the graph is shifting left to right, we can no longer start at the coordinate point 0, 0, or 0 on the x-axis or some value on the y-axis. So our starting point, it's easy to find if you like working with fractions. What you do is you take everything inside the parentheses here and set it equal to 0. X plus pi over 2 equal to 0. And then solve the equation. So subtract the pi over 2 from both sides, and what we find out is that our starting point gives us value of x is equal to negative pi over 2. So because it's at negative pi over 2 on the x-axis instead of 0, the graph is going to shift left. And it will shift left by pi over 2 units. All right, so that's the first thing we need to find is our starting point. Then we're only going to graph these for one period in the positive direction and one period in the negative direction. So we need to find those two endpoints. The endpoints are easy to find. What it is the endpoint. Let me put that up top of here to parallel everything else. Our endpoint is equal to our starting point plus or minus the period. So we're going to do this calculations twice. First time we're going to add the period, and then the second time we're going to subtract the period. So this is our starting point. So our first endpoint, that'll be negative pi over 2 plus 2 pi. Okay, we need a common denominator to add those, so endpoint will be negative pi over 2 plus 4 pi over 2. So our first endpoint is equal to 3 pi over 2. And we'll do the same set of calculations for our second endpoint, except we're going to subtract this time. So our second endpoint is negative pi over 2 minus 2 pi this time. Okay, so our second endpoint will equal to negative pi over 2 minus 4 pi over 2. Don't forget your common denominator. Our second endpoint is negative 5 pi over 2. Okay, those are our endpoints. We know they're critical values, but there are other critical values on our graph as well. Let me scroll up and we'll talk about how to figure those out. There we go. Sorry about that. Scrolling up. Okay, so let's think about what we have. If this is our table of values, get a table of values set up here. There's our x value, and this will be the sine of x plus pi over 2 when we work it out. Okay, so our leftmost point is negative 5 pi over 2. And then we're going to break it up into 4 equal pieces. 1, 2, 3, 4. And then this will be our starting point, kind of right in the middle. Instead of being 0, that is our negative pi over 2. And then we know there are critical points above that, 4 equal pieces. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, so how do we get these critical values? I like to find this point first, and likewise we'll find this point. It's not as easy as before. We have to do some work. What I'm going to do is, because this point is halfway between the starting point and this end point, we're going to average these two together. Add them together, divide by 2. So what I'm going to do is I'll put the calculations right here for you. Negative pi over 2 plus, oops, I'm sorry, that should be a 3 pi over 2. I put the wrong value there. Okay, let's just change that to our positive 3 pi over 2. That was the positive endpoint, so make sure you get that correction there. Plus 3 pi over 2. Now, we're working with fractions, so I'm not going to divide by 2. I'm going to multiply by the reciprocal of 1/2. Okay, negative pi over 2 plus 3 pi over 2. That will give you 2 pi over 2 times 1/2. Simplify that down. That is pi times 1/2. We come up with pi over 2. So our middle critical point up here is pi over 2. Coming back here, we're going to do the same set of calculations to find this critical point. It's halfway between these two, so we're going to average those together. Okay, so this time that is the negative 5 pi over 2 plus negative pi over 2. Again, we're going to multiply by 1/2 instead of dividing by 2. So that's negative 6 pi over 2 times 1/2. Negative 6 over 2 reduces down to negative 3 pi times 1/2. So that is negative 3 pi over 2 for this critical value. See, I told you there's more calculations. Okay, now we just got to do this 4 more times. 1, 2, 3, 4 to find these critical values. Sometimes you can think about it. What's halfway between negative pi over 2 and positive pi over 2? Well, that happens to be 0. If you can't see that and think of it, what you do is you just average them together again. Negative pi over 2 plus pi over 2 times 1/2. So that's 0 times 1/2, or 0. Okay, what's halfway between pi over 2 and 3 pi over 2? Let's average those together again. Pi over 2 plus 3 pi over 2 times 1/2. So pi plus 3 pi, that's 4 pi over 2 times 1/2. That's 2 pi times 1/2. So that critical value right there is pi. Okay, keep going. We need a little more room here, so let me scroll up again to get our last remaining critical points. Okay, what's halfway between these two? That is negative 3 pi over 2 plus negative pi over 2 times 1/2. That's negative 4 pi over 2 times 1/2. Negative 2 pi times 1/2. Negative pi. So that one is negative pi. There is not symmetry anymore. This is negative pi over 2. This is 0. This is negative pi. Don't make the mistake of just copying your positives over to here. We now actually have to do the work. Okay, let's average these two together. Negative 5 pi over 2 plus negative 3 pi over 2 times 1/2. So that's negative 8 pi over 2 times 1/2. That's negative 4 pi times 1/2. Negative 4 times 1/2 is negative 2 pi. So this point right here, negative 2 pi. Okay, that seems like a lot of work just to get our critical values, and honestly, sometimes it is. Please don't panic over those. All right, let me scroll back up here so we can see where we started. We have found the period, starting point, the right endpoint, the leftmost endpoint, and then we did the work to find all of our critical values. Okay, from here, what you'll do is you have to work these out and then plot the graph, okay? When you work these out, this is a sine graph, so our starting point will be at 0, 1, 0, -1, 0, -1, 0, 1, 0. You'll work these out just like we did before. You'll plug them into the sine of x plus pi over 2 with all of your critical values, and you'll work them out to get these. All right, let's plot those and see what happens. All right, here we go. I'm going to scroll up. I'm going to make my graph down here. We're still going to put the xy axis right smack dab in the middle. Now let's get those critical points. Let's take a look at them one last time. So we have, let's just memorize these: negative pi over 2, 0, pi over 2, pi, and 3 pi over 2. Okay, so there is our 0. This is our negative pi over 2. This is our 0. What was next there? Pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2. I'm sorry, that's not the 0. The 0 is right here. 0, pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2. We're going to go backwards in this direction, so that would be negative pi, negative 3 pi over 2, negative 2 pi, and negative 5 pi over 2. Okay, so this was our starting point, so the graph will start here. And then at 0 we were 1. We're just plotting those points we worked out up above. -1, positive. So you can see that this is one period of our graph right here. Notice how the entire graph is kind of shifted to the left. That whole thing is shifted to the left. And then we'll continue to plot the remaining points here and draw a nice smooth curvy line. Okay. Hopefully this part is nothing new, that you're pretty good at plotting the points and connecting the dots. That's it. A lot more work this time, but in the end we produce a nice, neat graph with accurate plotted points at our critical values, and that's what's important here.